Thank you, Chris. So it's indeed an honor to present some of the guidelines that are available in the South African context, and most probably in the absence of similar guidelines in other healthcare professions, it might serve a little bit of as a baseline or a point of departure for you. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if I can get that done. Can you see my screen?
No, it's not visible.
Okay. Give me a moment. Visible now?
Yeah, it's coming up. Yes, it has been shared.
Thank you very much. Okay. I think the first thing that I just want to mention is that as much as I'm located in the Department of Psychology at UNISA, the auspices under which I'm presenting today would be the Psychological Society of South Africa, and in particular, the Sexuality and Gender Division. It's from that perspective that just a brief mention, PsySSA is indeed the nationally representative largest psychology association in South Africa, and also recognized as a learned society. And that might just be relevant for you to understand the presentation and the context in which that happens. I'm going to start off by reflecting a little bit on what has already been mentioned, and I'm not going to go into the detail of the slide because I do think it's already been covered by both Chris and Elmar. But perhaps I can say that the slide I historically refer to as the history of sexual and gender identity disorders. And in this morning's preparation, I actually thought in future, the title should be the history of depathologization of the diversity of sexual and gender identity, because I do think it's becoming increasingly a relevant framing for it. And you'll see that I've bracketed the historically sinners, criminals, and sick in that first bullet. And of course, because we would hope that sexually and gender diverse were historically viewed as sinners, criminal, and or sick. But sadly, those labels hold in many respects today still. And if you think of the mental health implications for individuals who may internalize those very oppressive labels, and if you think from a contextual and interpersonal perspective rather from than an intrapsychic perspective, then I think a lot of what Elmar mentioned as far as mental health implications, those are very powerful, oppressive labels for people to live with. We've made more strides with same-sex sexuality when it comes to depathologization. And indeed, there's a quote that I often refer to in terms of, in the 60s, you were sick if you liked being a homosexual. Now you're sick if you don't like being a homosexual. And of course, that refers very much to the so-called ego-dystonic homosexuality that was removed from the DSM, I think, as far back as 1987. I'm not going to go more into this slide, but knowing that depathologization is still very much on the cards for transgender realities. Bringing us closer to what I'm hoping to convey to you today, of course, in celebrating diversity, which is very much what this workshop today is about. Of course, we need to respond to the deprioritization, the marginalization, and the neglect, exclusion, discrimination, and or secondary victimization that so often happens in our South Africa and indeed in communities at large. But I suppose it's important to note that it also happens within our law, it happens in the workplace, it happens in psychological practice, and of course, by extension, we can say within mental health practice more broadly. And that is precisely what forged the efforts within the Psychological Society of South Africa to indeed address what is a contribution that psychology has made to the oppression that I've already mentioned, and that, of course, psychology is trying to undo, and trying to undo in very definitive ways. Perhaps just to locate PsySSA's work in this field, it's important to note that a lot of what we're doing is under a specific project under the Sexuality and Gender Division, where both Chris, myself, and quite a few others that are in this workshop today are members, and also members of the executive committee. Our work dates back to 2010, when the PsySSA African LGBTI Human Rights Project was initiated, and then also we received funding to do some of the work that we were able to do. And this work was done under the context of the International Psychology Network for LGBTI Issues. I will be showing a last slide where the website where you can find ISINet will be reflected. And perhaps it is also pertinent for me to mention that you'll find on their website the ISINet affirmative statement on LGBTIQA+ concerns. And it's been signed by more than 30 national psychology associations up to this point. So indeed, there's massive strides being made in psychology to undo the harm that was done historically. A lot of this work is then also supported by the American Psychological Association, which we have to acknowledge as pioneers in the field of affirmative practice, which is very much what I understand this workshop, but also my presentation to be about. And you'll see some of the objectives of our project being listed there, the last of which is indeed the development of affirmative practice guidelines. So just so that you know what I will be focusing on in what will be a relatively brief presentation, to also allow us to make up for a little bit of time, I really do think the only purpose for my presentation is to show that indeed mental health professionals have had a serious rethink of what we've done over the years, and that what psychology has done might give that point of departure that I mentioned earlier for other healthcare professionals in the country. I've specifically shown the web link on this slide so that either you can already visit the website and download the guidelines that I'm talking of now, or at a later stage do so. I will briefly reflect then on what an affirmative stance entails, because that is at the crux of the presentation. I'll reflect on the need and the purpose of the guidelines, as well as the development process that we followed. And then very briefly, how to engage with our document and the 12 guidelines. And I'm just going to say enough about the guidelines to make you curious, that you indeed will go and download and or critically peruse what we have developed. So let's look at what an affirmative stance is about. I think the really important aspect to mention is that it's a cultivated position or lens, and it's about ongoing sensitivity to and acceptance of sexual and gender diversity. So we don't think this is a given, it's a default position, but we do believe you can arrive at having an affirmative stance, and a workshop like today, of course, is a contributing to that. So just reflecting on what it would include, of course, we have to undo our thinking around normality and abnormality. And in that regard, I think by now you'll have a clear sense that PsySSA considers sexual and gender diversity as part of the human condition, as part of a diverse spectrum, and indeed that the words normal and abnormal do not belong in such a conversation. Certainly, in understanding an affirmative stance, the presentation by Elma is really important. One has to understand, have a contextual understanding of the harm done by prejudice that is so embedded in not only the healthcare professions, but of in society at large. And that indeed, except for that overt prejudice, there's a whole range of barriers that LGBTI people are presented with in society and in relations with significant others. And that, of course, would similarly apply to transgender individuals. So if you are going to be affirmative in your position, you have to have empathy with the unique experiences of trans individuals in this instance. And you have to be knowledgeable of the diversity. And I think already the presentations to date alluded to the diversity within the trans experience. It's certainly not a one-size-fits-all. And if you are going to be affirmative, you have to acknowledge that uniqueness. You also have to hold a positive view of your client or your patient's world. And you have to recognize that as much as there's harm that was done, there's trauma, there's processes that have to be undone, so to speak, there's a lot of resilience and resourcefulness and creativity in trans individuals that you have to recognize and incorporate in what you do. And then, of course, very importantly, you have to check yourself for your blind spots. You have to develop a comfortable, to be comfortable with your own sexuality and gender if you're going to do work in this field. So the need for the guidelines, and I think that first bullet potentially says it all. In such a homo, trans, biphobic world, psychological services or mental health care provision may be the last safe space that sexually and gender diverse people can seek out away from that persistent discrimination and hate. And then certainly, we know that the world in which we live is very much still hetero-cis normative, all very big words. A shortcut to tell you what that is about would be to say that in the guidelines that I'm hoping you will download, you'll find a glossary, and a glossary that will give you definitions of that. But then we know that these hetero-cis normative positions that are so dominant play out in healthcare provision as well, and it affects not only the access to, but also the quality of such healthcare services. And certainly we know that, as I think Elma has already alluded, indeed the discrimination and negative encounters would not just be in communities at large, it indeed happens in healthcare provision as well. So there's really a need for healthcare providers to I can hear sort of a disturbance in the background. Somebody can mute themselves, please. I'm going to continue in the meantime. Indeed, we know that there's a lack of adequate services as a norm, and there's ignorance around sexual and gender diversity, and there's indeed a lack of training that's okay, I see I was muted for a moment and I've unmuted myself again. The lack of training in this field that is really important for us to address, and is one of those instances where we do that. What is, and for some reason I can't move my presentation, purposes of the guidelines. I think it's already evident in what I've said is that the need for an affirmative stance and developing such an affirmative stance is what these guidelines would attempt to do. As already alluded to as well, we are over-reliant on international guidelines, and so much the more the need for local guidelines to truly African positions in this field. And then with that in mind, of course, it would have been inappropriate for psychology to develop something for all mental health professionals. It would have been inappropriate for South Africa to develop something for the continent as a whole. But we know from feedback that we've received, and indeed the way that other mental health professionals also elsewhere in the continent has dealt with the guidelines, that it has relevance to other contexts beyond psychology and beyond South Africa. But we did also feel that, of course, our guidelines needed to be consistent with the constitutional and legal frameworks, and of course, those frameworks that regulate professions. And certainly we know that our guidelines are aligned with the HPCSA guidelines for psychology, ethical rules, and having trained quite a lot of social workers in these guidelines, we know that it's similarly aligned with the ethical code of social workers. But ultimately, it is about supplementing a harm avoidance approach in what we do. I'm going to be very quick around this very dense slide. And just to say that before we developed the guidelines, we found it appropriate to first develop a position statement. And our position statement in PsySSA dates back to 2013. That is also available on our website, so also interesting reading. And then the work was done by a core team, and indeed that core team has gotten the name the Flaming Faggots with time, and I'll allude to why that is the case. But very importantly, there was an extended group of experts who contributed and were critical readers, and many of the people in this call today form part of that larger extended group. But the development work then happened over many years, and in the end was approved by the highest decision-making body in PsySSA. So the guidelines are not those of the sexuality and gender division only. It's not the guidelines of our project only. It's guidelines that inform PsySSA as that learned society. So there's the Flaming Faggots. And if we had more time, I would have individually introduced the individuals on the slide. So you'll see Chris McLaughlin, for those of you who know Chris, the second to the left from on my slide. And this is a photo that goes back a few years, as you'll also see, and the picture of me on the far right. But yeah, why the Flaming Faggots will be revealed later. I'm going to show a video of the launch of the guidelines, and I hope the sound is going to be audible on your side.
Good evening and welcome. Every one of you giving up your time to be with us tonight, the Sexuality and Gender Division and PsySSA. And so tonight we're all gathered here as psychologists, as practitioners, as academics, as people interested in social change and transformation and actively work towards this. And in many ways, this is what the guidelines and the reason that we're here for speaks to. The work that we do as allies connects us to the work that we do as social activists.
In a country where a course on gender is not compulsory, and even as an elective, it is offered in not all the institutions, but a few of the institutions that we have in this country, because we do not think it is a significant part of our degrees. And this is across faculties. And yet gender affects every dimension of our lives, every dimension of our clients' lives, and every dimension
start making that and be the platform for training, for changing curricula at universities, and you know, we'll and lots of our allies are working towards that going forward.
And there you can see the theme, and I think the theme is particularly relevant at this point in time. So Mamela is meaning listen with humility and acting with integrity. And that's what we try to do with the work. You can see that these practice guidelines is an attempt at doing that. There are many field of practitioner-related matters. So I think we're truly blessed, and I think from that perspective, it's a historic occasion. I hope everyone can hear me. Apologies, it seems like the sound was intermittent. I'm going to be relatively quick in terms of the rest of the presentation, and it's to give you a little bit of a sense of how to engage with the documents. And in that regard, it's important to note that each section is a standalone. Can you hear me now? Can I have someone who can just confirm for me? Fantastic. Okay, I'm looking at a WhatsApp feed, so I can see that the sound was intermittent at times. So certainly each section is a standalone and written by different authors. Secondly, it's important to cross-reference the guidelines that you'll find. So our advice is to scan read the whole document, which is an 85-pager, for those of you who had sound at that point that was mentioned. So it's really quite a handbook in and of itself. But having said that, of course, you can then zoom into the guideline that has most direct relevance for the case that you might be dealing with or what you're trying to understand. There is the glossary that I mentioned, so terminologies that are outlined. And I must say, as we released the guidelines in 2018, we were already aware of some of the terminologies that have changed, and that was alluded to by some of the previous speakers. So our apologies up front for where there might be some slightly outdated terminologies, but I do think it gives you a very firm reference point. There's also some appendixes that you might find relevant. So the guidelines have a very specific structure, and it's around the rationale and application of each of these. So we do explain why there's a need for a guideline, and we do give some supporting data from research and then professional consensus, some of which has already been mentioned as key authors and documents in this workshop. And when it comes to the application, there's suggestions for practice use. There's demonstrations of appropriate uses, and there's anecdotal examples that we mentioned. So I'm going to quickly give you just the keyword that describes each of the 12 guidelines, and then I'm going to only read some of the guidelines in full in the interest of time. Again, advising you to download and read the guidelines for yourself. Guideline 1 is about non-discrimination, unsurprisingly so, because it's also aligned with our Constitution. Guideline 2, I think you'll find very interesting around individual self-determination. And I think already we've had some of the previous presenters talking about allowing people to identify themselves and to out themselves where they might find that relevant. Guideline 3, enhancing professional understanding. 4, awareness of normative social context, and that is indeed where hetero-cis normative contexts would be explained. Intersecting discrimination is, of course, a very important concept in the South African context, where we do have so many layers of discrimination. Counteracting stigma and violence, recognizing multiple developmental pathways, I can predict people find very interesting to make sense of as well. Non-conforming family structures and relationships, the necessity of an affirmative stance, and indeed that's the guideline that will give you a very clear sense of what an affirmative stance is about. Foregrounding global best practice care, disclosing and rectifying of personal biases, and then the need for continued professional development. I'm going to really read only the first three, and that's in the interest of time. And I do think that opening statement just gives an indication of how pertinent it was for PsySSA to make it clear that it has an understanding of its psychology's contribution, recognizing the harm that has been done in the past to individuals and groups by prejudice against sexual and gender diversity in South Africa, as well as in psychology. PsySSA hereby affirms the following. Psychology professionals respect human rights of sexually and gender diverse people, are committed to non-discrimination on the basis of sexuality and gender and biological variance. Number two, psychology professionals subscribe to notions of individual self-determination, including having the choice of self-disclosure. And then number three, psychology professionals acknowledge and understand sexual and gender diversity and fluidity, including biological variance. So I'm going to jump a few slides and then just a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but also quite seriously reflect on where how we know that our work indeed has impact. I authored an editorial in the the South African Journal of Psychology in 2014, and the title was "South African Psychology Can and Should Provide Leadership in Advancing Understanding of Sexual and Gender Diversity on the African Continent." And it clearly touched a nerve. So lo and behold, in 2016, Pastor Yolanda Ector chose to write to me, and the letter was really quite interesting, and I wish I could read it for you in full. So while I speak to it, of course, feel free to glance through it, but I won't be reading it all. I just read your article, and I was disappointed, to say the least. The reason I was disappointed was that you failed to include in your psychological probe the problem with white men mainly going over to Africa, enticing the young, starving African boys to have sex for food. So when I read that Africa does have laws, I was glad to read that Africa is standing up against an evil and perverted way of life. Why change a good thing? If you want to change something, change it back to what is good and right in the sight of the Lord. And if you don't turn people into flaming faggots because they were hungry, or that children are not sold as sex slaves. So, of course, there's where we derived our name from. And those of you who know the importance of reappropriating derogatory phrasings and ways that people try to oppress. But of course, this letter from Minister Yolanda Ector is an indication of how current religious condemnation and prejudice is still today. And it might be important for us to consider in our work. The second last slide, and just to say that PsySSA has taken its commitment further by developing an experiential workshop regarding the guidelines. It's a 3 or 4 day workshop. It's indeed experiential. It's indeed very much a sensitization workshop and about self-awareness. And it serves to increase competence in working in this field. So if you are interested in it, you'll find this flyer downloadable from the PsySSA Sexuality and Gender Division website as well. And to date, we have in fact trained 500 social workers in Gauteng that we really very happy for. But of course, we'd like to train more psychologists. We'd like to, well, we are available to try to train others in other healthcare professions should that be requested. There's my contact details, and also you'll see the ISINet website to the right bottom. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to the next presenter, hoping that you'll find value in the guidelines in the absence of other South African guidelines that are available at this point. Thank you very much.